It was December 1944. The trees in the Ardennes stood bare under heavy gray skies filled with snow. The wind cut through the forest, blowing flakes sideways across the frozen ground. Inside a camouflaged M10 Wolverine tank destroyer, Private First Class Ray Thompson peered through a fogged-up periscope. His breath was short and visible in the cold. His gloved hands shook, not from nerves, but from a freezing metal that surrounded him. Just 800 yards ahead, a column of German tanks crept through the woods. Most were Panzer IVs, with a Tiger leading the way. Behind them rolled troop carriers and fuel trucks. They were heading for a key road junction. If they captured it, they'd cut off supplies and reinforcements to the 101st Airborne Division, now trapped in Bastogne. Thompson hadn't been told to shoot. His orders were clear: watch, wait, report. But looking at that advancing column, he made a decision. He didn't ask. He didn't wait. Ray Thompson pulled the trigger, and everything changed. 3 days earlier, in a cold farmhouse near the Belgian front, Thompson sat at a metal desk during a briefing for the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion. His commanding officer laid down the rules. No one opens fire without direct orders. I don't care what you see. I don't care how close they get. Don't give away your position unless command says so. Everyone nodded, but the tension was thick. They all knew the enemy was coming, and fast. Outside, the Battle of the Bulge was just starting. On December 16th, hidden by fog and snow, German forces launched one last major attack in the west. They called it Operation Watch on the Rhine. Their goal was to split the Allied lines, take the port city of Antwerp, and force peace talks. Over 200,000 German troops and more than 1,000 tanks hit the front lines by surprise. Some American units were overrun overnight. Frontline positions changed constantly. In the chaos, U.S. commanders worried more about friendly fire than the enemy ahead. So the rule was simple: wait for orders. That meant observation duty for Thompson and his 3-man crew. They were dug into a ridge near a forest road north of Nouville, not far from Bastogne. Their position gave them great cover and a clear view of the valley, but no green light to shoot. Thompson watched the area nonstop. Through his scope, he tracked tank movements, counted trees crushed by treads, and noted enemy activity in a notebook his mom had sent him. He logged everything: range, direction, wind, speed. But he held fire. Once, he tracked a single German tank for nearly an hour as it moved near a ravine. No orders came. He let it go. That moment stuck with him. But he followed the rules. He knew one wrong shot could lead to disaster, American casualties, or their position exposed and targeted by German artillery. Still, as more enemy vehicles rolled through the woods, the question started to shift. Was staying quiet really safer? Thompson wasn't impulsive. He was calculated. He studied enemy movements like solving a puzzle. He understood their formations, how they grouped tanks for support, how they relied on tight coordination. And he knew exactly where to strike if he ever got the chance. What he didn't know was that he'd have to make that call himself. So, who was Ray Thompson? Raymond Charles Thompson didn't grow up dreaming of war. He came from the open plains of western Kansas, where winters were harsh and summers scorched the earth. His dad, Charles, ran a small engine repair shop. His mom, Anna, taught middle school math. Ray was raised around tools, parts, and problem solving. Even as a kid, he saw the world through shapes and numbers. He could figure out how far away a silo was just by its shadow. While other kids played with slingshots, Ray built his own using pulleys and weights to see how far he could launch a stone with perfect accuracy. He didn't join the army to fight. He signed up in 1942 to study engineering. The army offered training, a paycheck, and a future. He got the training. The pay wasn't much. The future? That depended on getting through Europe alive. By the time he reached Normandy, Ray was 22, though he looked older. His first taste of combat came in the hedgerows, where you could be just 10 feet from the enemy without knowing it, until the shooting started. He saw his friend Jimmy Delgado burn to death when a Panzer shell hit their half-track in a ditch. Another buddy, Frank Murray, was killed by a landmine outside St. Lo. After that, Ray stopped believing in luck or orders or the idea of a safe distance. What he believed in were patterns and sticking to them. He paid attention to every move the tanks made, how they rolled, where they paused, how long it took to turn their turrets. He started keeping a small notebook in his jacket pocket. Anytime he saw a German vehicle, he'd draw it, mark its weak points, and list where its blind spots were. Ray didn't talk much. The guys started calling him the quiet clock, because whenever he did speak, it was brief, exact, and always well-timed. But when it came to firing the gun, he was deadly accurate. Not flashy, not fast, just reliable. Every shot was calculated. The Army saw him as a solid gunner, smart, steady, and cool under pressure. What most people didn't notice, not even the guys in his own crew, was that Ray wasn't just good at pulling the trigger. He was a thinker. He could break down a battlefield like it was a problem to solve. In just 3 days, this quiet guy from Kansas, obsessed with angles, was about to make a choice that would change everything. One burst of firepower, and the rules would shift. Because sometimes, war doesn't reward those who follow every order. Sometimes, it rewards the ones who know exactly when to go off script. The situation. It was the morning of December 19th, 1944. A thick fog hung over the Ardennes. It clung to the trees and muffled every sound. Visibility was low. Everything was quiet. But through a scope, Ray spotted something. First came the shape of a Tiger Eye tank. No mistaking that long barrel and heavy frame. Then another, and another. The German column was moving in tight formation down a narrow forest road. 12 armored vehicles, maybe more. It was a classic assault setup. The Tiger led the charge, able to break through just about anything in its way. Right behind it came 3 Panzer IVs, fast, aggressive, and dangerous. Then 2 half-tracks full of infantry. Behind those were supply trucks, fuel carriers, even a mobile kitchen. At the very end was a self-propelled anti-aircraft gun. That meant they expected resistance, and were ready for it. Except they hadn't counted on Ray. The road they were on was barely wider than the vehicles themselves. Trees and hills closing on both sides. There was no room to move, no way to escape. What looked like a path forward was, in Ray's eyes, a perfect trap. But there was a problem. He had no orders. Radio contact with his command post was spotty, sometimes completely silent. To reach them, he'd have to move and risk giving away his position. According to protocol, he was supposed to observe, report, and let someone else, maybe air support or artillery, handle it. But that's not what Ray saw. He didn't see just another column passing through. He saw a threat aimed directly at the American line. That narrow road led straight to the town of Noville. If the Germans made it through and took that junction, they'd outflank the U.S. forces holding Bastogne from the north. The 101st Airborne Division was already surrounded. If their last supply route was cut off, thousands of American troops would be trapped in freezing conditions with no way out. And the German tanks kept rolling, steady and confident. They thought American units were too scattered, too unorganized to respond. They were half right. Ray Thompson was freezing. He was alone. And yeah, he was scared. But he wasn't unprepared. He knew if he fired too early, the Germans would break formation and scatter. If he picked the wrong target, they might counterattack, and his crew would be done for. But if he hit the right vehicles, in the right order, there was a chance to stop the whole column cold. He'd have to do it without support, without clearance, and without making a single mistake. He wiped his lips, reached for the elevation dial, looked through the scope one last time, and got ready for a moment no training manual ever covered. Breaking the rules. Ray Thompson had never fired without an order. Not once. Not during training. Not in France. Not even days ago when he had a clear shot at a lone German tank. He'd always held back. But now, looking at a full armored column laid out in front of him, he understood something. Waiting wasn't playing it safe anymore. Waiting meant disaster. So, without radio contact, without backup, and without permission, Ray made the call. He adjusted the gun's angle, held his breath, and squeezed the trigger. But he didn't aim for the lead tank. He targeted the third one. The armor-piercing round blasted from the M10's barrel, tearing through the still morning and launching a spray of snow into the air. The shell slammed into the 3rd Panzer IV's side and exploded. Fire and smoke filled the trees. Metal tore apart. The entire column stopped cold. Ray didn't stop. As his loader slammed in another shell, Ray shifted the M10 a few yards to the left, just enough to throw off anyone trying to spot his position from a flash. Then he fired again, this time targeting the sixth vehicle in the column. The shell tore through a half-track, carrying enemy troops. Its fuel tank exploded instantly. Flames ripped through the forest floor, lighting up the underbrush in bursts of fire. Some of the soldiers were thrown into the trees. The rest scattered. The German line wasn't just stopped anymore. It was falling apart. The Tiger tank at the front tried to reverse, but it was stuck. The vehicles were too tightly packed. The crew shouted, waving their arms, trying to direct others to clear a path. But the rest of the column was now jammed, blind, and boxed by flames and wreckage. Thompson reloaded. His crew was now fully awake to what was happening, and no one asked questions. They just moved, followed his lead. Next, he aimed at the eighth vehicle, a fuel truck. The shot hit dead on. The blast rocked the hillside. A wall of fire shot into the air. It looked like something out of a nightmare, bright, violent, unstoppable. Two nearby infantrymen were knocked to the ground by the force of the blast. In the glow, the tanks looked like black outlines flickering in the firelight. From a distance, it sounded like a full-scale American ambush. But it wasn't. It was one tank, one man, and a decision Ray Thompson hadn't fired at random. His targeting was methodical. He'd studied German formations for months. He knew their playbook. Heavy armor in front, infantry in the middle, fuel and support at the rear. By hitting the third vehicle, he blocked their advance. The sixth, in the center, jammed their troop movement. The eighth, that lit up their fuel and wiped out the chance of retreat. This wasn't just combat. It was strategy, each shot chosen to break the formation from the inside. Quick, surgical, controlled. Every shell he fired was meant to cause maximum disruption with minimum exposure. The German troops panicked. They fired wildly into the trees. Machine guns tore through snowbanks and empty branches. Infantry hit the ground or ducked behind burning vehicles. No one knew where the shots were coming from. To them, it felt like a trap, like a coordinated attack from an entire squad of American tank destroyers. But there was no trap, no squad, just Ray and his crew, 3 men doing the work of many. As the enemy scattered, Thompson repositioned. He moved like a sniper, shifting just enough to stay hidden. 10 yards here, 20 there. He used the terrain like cover, selecting each spot with purpose. Higher ground, better angles, more concealment. He wasn't just shooting. He was taking them apart piece by piece. The forest, quiet before the first shot, now echoed with chaos. Trees cracked and fell. Fire and snow exploded into the air with each impact. Thompson's next shell hit another fuel truck. The one after that struck a reversing half-track, flipping off the icy road in a twisted mess of steel. The lead Tiger was trapped. It couldn't move forward. It couldn't turn around. The road behind it was jammed with burning wreckage, and trying to force through meant ramming into their own men. Their perfect formation, so effective in open country, was now a steel trap. From Thompson's position, it played out in slow motion. He could see the panic. Troops yelling. Officers trying to take control. Some infantry dropped their gear and ran for the woods. Some hid behind trees. Others slipped on ice and tumbled through the snow in total confusion. One officer climbed on top of a tank to get a better view. Thompson cut him down with a burst from the .50 caliber machine gun mounted on an M10. Inside the tank destroyer, his crew was sweating not from fear but from the effort. The loader's hands were raw. The assistant gunner's voice was going hoarse from shouting distances and bearings. The air smelled like oil, hot metal, and spent shells. But Ray Thompson was locked in. No panic, no guesswork, just numbers and angles. He repositioned after every 2 shots. Not far, just enough to keep the enemy guessing. The fog, the smoke, the terrain, they all helped. But what helped most was the illusion. The Germans thought they were caught in an ambush. Some swore they were under fire from 4 tanks. Others said 8. There were even reports of U.S. artillery in the hills, none of which were actually there. The truth? One M10 Wolverine, 3 men, and a gunner who chose to act on instinct instead of waiting for orders. Within 30 minutes, the road was a graveyard of burning steel. At least 5 enemy vehicles were completely destroyed. 3 more were disabled and blocking the route. Survivors from the rear, mostly fuel and supply crews, turned and ran back into the woods. Finally, the Tiger managed to rotate its turret. It slowly turned toward the ridge where Thompson had last fired. Ray didn't blink. He knew the Tiger's armor was nearly impossible to break from the front, but its sides, much weaker. And if you waited for just the right moment, when the tank pivoted and the side panel came into view, you had a shot. He took it. The 5th shell tore into the Tiger's flank. For a second, the tank held. Then the ammo inside ignited, and everything blew. The Tiger's turret blew off completely, launched into the air by the blast, and crashing down several yards away. The explosion was so powerful, it knocked the German anti-aircraft gun at the back of the column off balance. Its stunned crew dropped their weapons and fled into the forest. Smoke now hung low between the trees, drifting like fog. The wreckage glowed against the cold, gray light of morning. That narrow road, once a symbol of German firepower, was now a burning mess of twisted metal. One of Thompson's crew looked over and asked, "So, are we still getting court-martial for this?" Ray didn't answer. He just chambered another round. The fight wasn't over. The German view, a ghost battery. Hours later, in a makeshift holding tent, an American officer questioned a captured German lieutenant. His face was blackened with soot, his coat partly burned, and his eyes wide with shock. He struggled to speak. "There were many guns," he said in broken English. "Maybe 6, maybe more. We were attacked by a full battery." The American officers looked at each other. They knew there had been no battery, no squad, no support, just one tank destroyer, one crew, and a gunner who never got permission to fire. Other German prisoners gave different accounts. Some believed they'd been hit by American paratroopers with anti-tank weapons. Others said the road had been mined. One swore he saw muzzle flashes from 3 directions. But every flash came from the same place, Ray Thompson, who kept moving after each shot to throw off return fire. In their panic, the Germans had started imagining enemies that weren't there. Fear filled in the blanks. Even experienced tank officers claimed they saw U.S. armor deeper in the woods. It wasn't cowardice. It was psychology. They couldn't wrap their heads around the fact that one man had done this. To them, it shouldn't have been possible. A single tank destroyer taking out an entire armor column with that kind of precision, that kind of impact. And in a way, they were right. This wasn't brute force. This was surgical. Ray had picked his targets for a reason. The 3rd, the 6th, and the 8th vehicles. Each shot broke the column's formation and its logic. He used their own tactics against them. German training assumed American troops followed orders, moved slow, and relied on strength in numbers. What they didn't expect was a soldier who broke that mold. Ray Thompson didn't follow protocol. He thought like a German officer and struck like a ghost. One prisoner described it best. "The trees fired at us." Another said he heard whistling, maybe from the shells, maybe just the wind. No one was sure. Fear had warped memory. When American forces finally arrived to clear the road, even seasoned vets were stunned by what they saw. Burned-out vehicles were stacked like dominoes. Metal frames had melted and fused. Frozen bodies lay scattered in the snow, still gripping their weapons. Trees were splintered like kindling. Tank tracks were bent sideways, half buried in the dirt. But the most surprising detail? Not a single American body. Because there hadn't been a fight. There had been one man with a plan, and the nerve to follow through. German survivors gave a name, Die Geister Battery, the Ghost Battery, disobedience or brilliance. For the next 2 days, Ray Thompson expected the worst. After the smoke cleared, after the last German ran or burned, he sat quietly inside the M10. When his loader offered him a drink, he didn't respond. The adrenaline was gone. All that was left was the waiting. They had broken orders. No authorization. No clearance. And even with all those destroyed tanks, the military had rules. Back at HQ, Ray filed his report. His commanding officer, a captain named Langston from Pittsburgh, read it without saying a word. He flipped through the pages, Ray's hand-drawn diagrams, firing angles, impact estimates. His face shifted from confusion to disbelief to something close to frustration. If this had gone wrong, Langston finally said, if even one of those shots hit friendlies... Ray nodded. I knew what I saw, he said. Langston stared at him, then sighed. No one cleared this, Thompson. You get that, right? I do. But Langston didn't write him up. Not then. He just said, go get some rest. I've got to send this upstairs. Upstairs meant division command, which meant scrutiny, and usually punishment, especially for lower-ranked soldiers who stepped outside the chain of command. Ray returned to his crew. No one said much. No high-fives. No celebrations. They were just waiting for the fallout. But that's not what happened. Something else did first. 2 days later, scouts from the 101st Airborne arrived through Noville. Their faces were pale, eyes bloodshot from cold, exhaustion, and trench exposure. They expected to find a forest road full of enemy armor. Instead, they found wreckage, burned-out tanks, twisted metal, and silence. They asked which unit had taken out the column. Langston told them it wasn't a unit. It was one man. Word spread fast, faster than any official report. Across mess tents, supply lines, and over battalion radios, soldiers started talking about the guy from Kansas who took out a German tank column on his own. Some stories stretched the truth. Said he knocked out 10 tanks with just 5 shells. Said he banked his shots like a pool player. But while the myth grew, the real investigation began. Division intelligence went over Ray Thompson's field notes. They interviewed his loader, his assistant gunner. They even tried to verify if any orders had come through that day. But they found no record of a green light. Radio lines had been jammed. Thompson's crew tried call in. Nothing came back. They couldn't prove he disobeyed, because technically, there were no clear orders to disobey. What they could prove was this: 7 enemy vehicles destroyed, 4 more disabled, 0 American casualties, 1 key road, Noville's North Road, held, 1 surrounded U.S. unit reconnected to its supply line, 1 silent decision that made it happen. Langston was called in for the final review. He expected trouble. Instead, he was told quietly, don't include this in the briefing. Not yet, but tell your gunner we're watching his work. Ray Thompson didn't get a medal. Not then, but he also wasn't punished. Instead, he was quietly reassigned to teach gunners about something new: how to break a convoy using sequence, not sheer force. No one called him a hero. No one gave speeches. But they asked for his diagrams. His notes were sent to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, to the U.S. Army Artillery School. That's when Ray realized they weren't just letting him off the hook. They were learning from him. Weeks later, while he was cleaning a recoilless rifle, Langston stopped by. You know, he said, I was ready to write you up for insubordination. Ray looked up. But then I read what you wrote about controlled collapse. What did you mean? Ray wiped his hands. If you pull the right stone out of a wall, he said, the whole thing falls. If you know where to pull. Langston smiled. Next time you decide to bring down a wall, give me a heads up. Ray didn't smile. He just nodded. Because to him, this wasn't a win. It was math, a move made out of necessity. And he knew full well it could have gone the other way. But sometimes war doesn't punish the rule breakers. Sometimes it learns from them, the pattern that changed doctrine. Ray Thompson never asked for attention. He didn't keep journals. He didn't pose for cameras. After the war, he went back to Kansas, married a girl named Helen, and opened a repair shop near Dodge City. He fixed tractors, built grain silos, and taught his son geometry by drawing angles in the dirt with a stick. He never once called himself a hero, but others did. Years after the Battle of the Bulge, the U.S. Army quietly began teaching something called asymmetrical engagement sequencing, a technical name for a simple idea. Don't aim for front. Aim to break the whole thing. They used one case study, An engagement outside Nouvelle, Belgium. It showed maps, wreckage trails, firing angles. No names were listed. It wasn't classified, but buried deep in artillery training manuals, most officers never bothered to read. Still, students at Fort Sill and later Fort Benning studied it because it worked, because it saved lives, because it changed what one gunner could mean, not with brute force, but with angles, logic, and the courage to act when no one else would. Years later, a colonel who had studied that case as a young officer put it this way: he didn't break orders. He operated beyond them. That became the paradox. The man who bent the rules became the model for smarter battlefield decisions. His approach, targeting choke points, turning formations against themselves, was eventually worked into Cold War doctrine. It shaped how U.S. tank destroyers were trained to face Soviet armor across Eastern Europe. And it all came from a kid from Kansas who never went to college. Decades later, a military historian came across Captain Langston's original after-action report in a dusty box of World War II records. It was stamped with a faded red line. The historian tracked down Thompson. He was in his 80s, living quietly with his wife and a cat named Murphy. When asked about that day in the Ardennes, Ray took a long pause. "I remember the trees," he said. "How still it was before the first shot, like the world was holding its breath." He didn't talk about heroism, or glory, or even regret, just precision, just the facts. When asked why he didn't wait for orders, he said, because by the time the radio worked, it would have been too late. Then he added, "I didn't break the rules. I just stepped past them for a minute, long enough to do what needed doing." That line never made it into any official history, but the historian remembered it. And maybe now, so do you. Ray Thompson didn't win the war, but he saved a road. He saved a battalion. He saved a moment. And in war, sometimes that's everything. Because courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it calculates. Sometimes it pulls the trigger, not to disobey, but because someone had to. One man, one moment, one pattern, and an entire column brought to a halt.